The sound of the slap cracked through the opulent bridal suite, sharp and violent, entirely out of place among the scent of white roses and the soft hum of the string quartet drifting up from the courtyard below. It was a staggering blow. Clara's head snapped to the side, her vision blurring for a fraction of a second as a profound, stinging heat bloomed across her left cheek. She stood frozen, a plain, unremarkable figure wrapped in a faded, ill-fitting charcoal dress, clutching a velvet jewelry box to her chest. Opposite her stood Victoria, the bride, her own sister. Victoria's chest heaved beneath the delicate, hand-stitched lace of her designer gown. Her meticulously styled blonde curls trembled, and her eyes, usually carefully widened in an expression of manufactured innocence, were narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated malice. She didn't look like a woman about to step into a fairy tale marriage. She looked like a predator that had just struck a wounded animal. "Watch where you are standing, you clumsy, useless creature," Victoria hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. She stepped closer, the expensive tulle of her skirt rustling like dry leaves. "You blocked my light, on my wedding day. Do you possess any awareness at all? Or are you truly as stupid as you look?" Clara did not raise her hand to touch her burning cheek. She did not cry out. At 32 years old, she had long ago learned that tears in this family were not met with comfort, but with further disdain. She merely lowered her eyes, staring at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug beneath their feet. This was the reality of Clara's life, a reality she had accepted out of a misplaced sense of duty. But to understand how a sister could strike her own flesh and blood on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and why Clara endured it in agonizing silence, one had to look back to the foundation of lies upon which this entire wedding had been built. Just 3 hours earlier, the atmosphere at the grand estate had been entirely different. The afternoon sun had bathed the manicured lawns in a golden, cinematic glow. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly among the early arrivals, carrying silver trays adorned with crystal flutes of champagne. At the center of it all stood Marcus. Marcus was a man who commanded respect without ever having to demand it. A self-made entrepreneur who had built a quiet empire from the ground up, he possessed a steady, grounded demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the flashy, shallow circles of wealth he often found himself navigating. He had broad shoulders, kind, perceptive eyes, and a smile that reached all the way to the corners of his face. He loved Victoria, or rather, he loved the version of Victoria she had carefully curated for him. A sweet, philanthropic, deeply family-oriented woman from a respectable old-money lineage. Beside Marcus stood Robert and Susan, the proud parents of the bride. Robert, dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo that he could not actually afford, laughed heartily at a joke made by one of Marcus's wealthy investors, swirling a glass of scotch with practiced ease. Susan, draped in emerald silk, patted Marcus's arm affectionately, playing the role of the warm, sophisticated matriarch to absolute perfection. "We are just so blessed, Marcus, dear," Susan crooned, dabbing the corner of her dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "To see our little girl marrying a man of such integrity. It is all a mother could pray for." "I'm the lucky one, Susan," Marcus replied warmly, his sincerity genuine. "You've raised an incredible daughter. The closeness of your family is something I've always admired." Robert puffed his chest out slightly. "Family is everything, Marcus. Blood is the only currency that truly matters in this world." While Robert preached about the sanctity of blood, his oldest daughter, Clara, was sweating in the stifling heat of the estate's service corridors. Clara had been strictly forbidden from showing her face in the main reception areas. "You don't fit the aesthetic, Clara," her mother had told her weeks ago, her tone casual but razor sharp. "Marcus's friends are very high society. We can't have them wondering why the bride's sister looks like she just finished a shift at a diner. You'll help the catering staff. It's the least you can do to support your sister." And so Clara worked. Her hands, calloused from years of carrying the financial and physical burdens of a family that lived far beyond its means, expertly folded linen napkins and arranged heavy floral centerpieces. She wore a drab, oversized charcoal dress, specifically chosen by Susan so Clara would blend in seamlessly with the hired help. Clara was the family's darkest, best-kept secret. She was the one who had quietly paid the mortgage when Robert's investments inevitably failed. She was the one who had funded Victoria's expensive college tuition by working 2 jobs, allowing her sister to maintain the illusion of being a carefree socialite. Clara was the workhorse, the invisible engine that kept the glamorous facade of her family running. And her reward was to be hidden away like a shameful stain on their perfect tapestry. Yet Clara stayed silent. She was bound by a deeply ingrained, almost paralyzing sense of familial loyalty, a heavy chain forged in her childhood. She had been taught that her worth was measured entirely by her usefulness to her parents and her beautiful younger sister. But destiny has a funny way of unraveling the most carefully spun lies. Needing a moment away from the overwhelming crowds, Marcus had excused himself and wandered down a quiet hallway to find a glass of water. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the grand dining hall to admire the setup. The room was breathtaking, empty save for one woman standing by the head table. Marcus paused. It was Clara. She was meticulously adjusting the placement of a crystal water goblet, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. A stray lock of dark hair had escaped her modest bun, framing a face that, while lacking Victoria's flashy cosmetics, possessed a striking, quiet dignity. Marcus noticed her hands. They were not the pampered, manicured hands of the women he usually associated with his fiancée's family. They were capable, hard-working hands. "Excuse me," Marcus said gently, not wanting to startle her. Clara gasped, nearly dropping the goblet. She turned, her eyes widening in sheer panic as she recognized the groom. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, immediately taking a subservient step backward, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I was just finishing the table arrangements. I'll leave immediately." Marcus frowned, his natural kindness kicking in. "Please don't apologize. You're doing a beautiful job. I just came in for some quiet." He took a step closer, studying her face. There was something strangely familiar about her bone structure, a subtle echo of Victoria, though the energy she carried was entirely different. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Marcus." He extended his hand. Clara stared at it as if it were a loaded weapon. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If her parents caught her speaking to him. "Marcus!" The sharp, panicked voice of Robert echoed through the hall. Both Marcus and Clara turned to see Robert and Susan practically sprinting into the room, their previously composed faces pale with sudden terror. Susan reached them first, immediately placing herself physically between Marcus and Clara. "Darling, we were looking all over for you. The photographer needs you for a few solo shots by the fountain." "I was just introducing myself," Marcus said, withdrawing his unclasped hand, slightly bewildered by the sudden intrusion. He gestured toward Clara. "She's done an incredible job with the hall. Are you with the catering company?" Silence descended like a heavy blanket. Clara kept her eyes glued to her scuffed black shoes, her breath shallow. Robert let out a forced, booming laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Oh, Marcus, my boy. No, she's not catering." He shot Clara a look of absolute venom before turning a sorrowful, patronizing gaze back to Marcus. "This is, well, it's a bit of a family tragedy, really." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Tragedy?" Susan sighed heavily, reaching up to touch her pearl necklace as if seeking comfort. "This is Clara. She's a very distant relative on Robert's side. The poor dear has had a very difficult life, severe emotional and mental instability. She can't hold down a real job, bless her heart." Clara felt a sickening knot twist in her stomach. Mentally unstable, a distant relative. The words hit her like physical blows, but years of conditioning kept her rooted to the spot, mute and obedient. "We took her in out of charity," Robert added smoothly, his voice dripping with faux nobility. "We give her simple tasks around the house, let her help out today to make her feel useful, but she gets very confused, very easily overwhelmed. It's best not to engage her in deep conversation, Marcus. She can become quite unpredictable." Marcus looked at Clara. He looked at her steady, calloused hands, her deeply intelligent, albeit terrified eyes. Nothing about her screamed instability. She looked like a woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. But he was looking at his future in-laws, people he believed to be the epitome of grace and honesty. Why would they lie? "I'm sorry to hear that," Marcus said softly, his voice full of genuine empathy. He looked directly at Clara, hoping she would meet his gaze. "It's nice to meet you, Clara. Thank you for your hard work today." Clara dared to flick her eyes up for a fraction of a second. She saw the kindness in his face, a kindness she had never experienced from a man in her entire life. It broke her heart. "Run!" she wanted to scream. "Run away from them, Marcus. They are bleeding you dry." Instead, she gave a stiff, jerky nod and practically fled the room through the service doors, the oppressive silence of the hallway swallowing her whole. Susan let out a dramatic breath. Thank goodness she didn't cause a scene. Come along, Marcus. Let's get you to the photographer. Marcus allowed himself to be led away, but a seed of doubt had been planted in the fertile soil of his sharp mind. The way Clara had looked at him wasn't the look of a confused, unstable woman. It was the look of a prisoner, which brought them to the current moment, 3 hours later, inside the suffocating tension of the bridal suite. The incident with Marcus had left Robert and Susan furious. They had berated Clara in the coat room, violently shaking her by the shoulders and warning her that if Marcus caught sight of her again, she would be thrown out onto the street the next day. Banished to the bridal suite to act as Victoria's personal servant, Clara was tasked with carrying the heavy, antique velvet jewelry box containing the diamond necklace Victoria was to wear. Victoria was a nervous wreck, snapping at the makeup artists until they fled the room in tears. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, obsessing over a microscopic wrinkle near the hem of her dress. "It's ruined," Victoria whined, stomping her foot like a petulant toddler. "The whole aesthetic is ruined. Mom!" Susan, who was sipping champagne on a velvet chaise lounge, waved her hand dismissively. "No one will notice, darling. You look like a princess." "I don't want to look like a princess. I want to look flawless," Victoria screeched. She spun around, her eyes frantically searching the room until they landed on her sister. "You, bring me the necklace, now!" Clara stepped forward, her movements careful and measured. She approached the podium where Victoria stood. To hand her the box, Clara had to step between Victoria and the tall window pouring natural light into the room. For 2 seconds, a shadow fell across Victoria's face in the mirror. That was all it took. The slap echoed. Clara's cheek burned. The cruel words, "Stupid as you look," hung in the air. "Don't just stand there like an idiot," Victoria yelled, her face contorted with ugly rage. "Open the box, put it on me. You're so useless, Clara. It's no wonder nobody wants you. You're lucky Dad hasn't thrown you in an asylum just to be rid of the burden." Before Clara could unlatch the brass clasp of the box, the heavy brass door handle of the bridal suite clicked. The door swung open. Marcus stood in the doorway. He was supposed to be at the altar. It was bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, but a logistical issue regarding the rings had forced him to come up personally. He froze, his hand still on the doorknob. His eyes took in the scene with the rapid, calculating precision of a seasoned businessman. He saw Clara, her head bowed, a stark, angry red handprint blooming vividly across her pale cheek. He saw Victoria, her arm still slightly raised, her face twisted in a snarl that was rapidly morphing into an expression of sheer panic. He saw Susan, half rising from the chaise lounge, spilling champagne down her expensive silk dress. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with the electricity of a coming storm. "What?" Marcus said, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all its usual warmth. "Is going on here?" The transformation in Victoria was terrifyingly instant. The snarling predator vanished, replaced by a trembling, fragile victim. Tears, real wet tears, welled up in her wide blue eyes. She let out a dramatic, breathy sob and stumbled backward, clutching her chest. "Marcus!" Victoria cried, her voice trembling perfectly. "Oh, Marcus, thank God you're here. I was so terrified." Marcus stepped fully into the room, letting the door close behind him. His eyes never left the red mark on Clara's face. "Terrified of what, Victoria? Why does she have a mark on her face?" Susan sprang into action, rushing across the room to wrap her arms around her trembling daughter. "Oh, Marcus, it was horrible. We tried to tell you earlier, but you wouldn't understand. Clara, she had an episode." Clara's heart stopped. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto her mother. "An episode? An episode?" Marcus repeated, his jaw tightening. "Yes," Victoria sobbed, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. "She came in here acting crazy, muttering to herself. She was jealous, Marcus. She said she hated that I was getting married. She picked up a pair of fabric scissors from the vanity. She was going to cut my dress." Clara's breath hitched. She looked at the vanity. There were no scissors. There had never been any scissors. It was a lie spun from thin air, delivered with the terrifying conviction of practiced con artists. "She came at me," Victoria continued, crying harder. "I panicked. I threw my hand out to stop her from ruining the dress, and I hit her. I didn't mean to. I was just defending myself. Marcus, you have to believe me. She's completely unhinged. Marcus looked at the three women. He looked at the hysterically crying bride, the fiercely protective mother. Then he looked at Clara. Clara stood perfectly still. The velvet box was still clutched safely in her hands. There was no wildness in her eyes, no frantic energy of a woman having a psychotic break. There was only a deep, bottomless well of exhaustion, a quiet, devastating resignation. "Clara," Marcus said, his voice cutting through Victoria's sobs. He took a step toward her. "Is this true? Did you threaten her?" Clara looked into Marcus's eyes. For a fleeting second, she wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to tell him that she was the sister, the provider, the victim. She wanted to tell him that he was marrying a monster. But as she opened her mouth, she caught sight of Susan's eyes over Victoria's shoulder. Susan wasn't crying anymore. Her eyes were hard, flat, and filled with a silent, deadly promise. "If you speak, you are dead to us. You will have nothing." Clara swallowed the bitter pill of her existence. She knew how the world worked. Who would a wealthy, successful man believe? His beautiful, weeping fiancée and her respectable mother? Or the dowdy, plain-looking woman they had already established as mentally unstable? If she fought back, it would only be a scene. A humiliating, ugly scene where she would inevitably be dragged out by security, painted as the crazy relative ruining the fairy tale. Clara lowered her eyes. She closed the velvet box with a soft click and set it carefully on the vanity. "No, sir," Clara whispered, her voice completely hollow, dead of any emotion. I just tripped. I startled her. It was my fault. I'm sorry." Victoria let out a loud, shuddering sigh of relief. "You see, Marcus? She doesn't even know what she's doing. Please, someone just get her out of here. I can't look at her anymore." Marcus didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on Clara. He heard the words she spoke, but he saw the way she held herself. A crazy person who had just tried to attack someone with scissors would not calmly set a jewelry box on a table. A woman having a psychotic episode would not have the tragic, profound clarity in her eyes that Clara had just displayed. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. "I'll escort her out," Marcus said quietly. "Oh no, Marcus, you shouldn't," Susan began, stepping forward. "I said," Marcus interrupted, his voice suddenly carrying the chilling authority of a man used to running boardrooms. "I will escort her out. Fix your daughter's makeup, Susan. The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. Without waiting for a reply, Marcus gently placed a hand on Clara's elbow. His touch was light, respectful. "Come with me, Clara." Clara didn't resist. She let him guide her out of the suffocating suite, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind them, sealing the liars inside. As they walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway, Marcus did not ask her any more questions. He did not press her for the truth he knew she was hiding. He simply walked beside her in silence. But as they reached the service elevator, Clara felt something slip from her messy bun. The sudden movement in the bridal suite must have loosened it. A small, tarnished copper hair clip clattered onto the polished marble floor. Marcus bent down to pick it up before Clara could. As his fingers brushed the cool metal, he froze. The clip wasn't just a piece of cheap metal. It was custom-made, cast in the distinct shape of an overlapping crescent moon and a rising sun. Marcus knew that symbol. It was permanently burned into his memory. It was the exact crest stamped onto the wax seal of the letters he had received 5 years ago. The letters from the anonymous angel investor who had single-handedly saved his tech company from bankruptcy. The brilliant, hidden financial mind he had spent years trying to track down to express his gratitude. Marcus looked from the copper clip in his hand up to the plain, bruised face of the mentally unstable maid standing before him. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly shifted, the picture distorting into something horrifying. The wedding march was about to begin, but for Marcus, the real investigation had just started, and he was going to tear this family's perfect facade apart, piece by piece. The hallway outside the service elevator was agonizingly quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic venom that had just unfolded inside the bridal suite. Marcus stood perfectly still, the heavy marble floor cold beneath his polished leather shoes. In his palm rested the tarnished copper hair clip. It was a simple utilitarian object, slightly greened with age at the edges, but the emblem embossed on its rounded surface was unmistakable, an overlapping crescent moon and a rising sun. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the small piece of metal, his mind forcefully violently thrown back 5 years into the past. Back then, Marcus had not been the confident, wealthy entrepreneur standing in a custom tuxedo. He had been a desperate man sitting in a cramped, unheated garage office, staring at a mountain of debt and a notice of imminent foreclosure on his startup. His company, his life's work, had been days away from complete annihilation. And then the letters had arrived. They were typewritten, anonymous, and always sealed with dark green wax stamped with this exact crest, the moon and the sun. The letters contained no money, but something far more valuable, a brilliant, ruthless, and flawlessly precise roadmap to financial recovery. The anonymous author had detailed exactly which predatory investors to cut loose, which obscure market loopholes to exploit, and how to restructure his debt in a way that his own highly paid lawyers had never even considered. The advice was so sophisticated, so deeply visionary, that Marcus had assumed it came from a seasoned Wall Street veteran taking pity on a struggling kid. He had spent years trying to track down his anonymous savior, wanting to offer them a stake in his now billion-dollar empire. He had hired private investigators, followed dead ends, and eventually given up, assuming the mysterious benefactor wanted to remain hidden. Slowly, Marcus lifted his gaze from the copper clip to the woman standing inches away from him. Clara was trembling. Her dark, intelligent eyes were fixed on his open palm, filled with a panic so profound it made her physically sway. She reached out, her calloused, hard-working fingers hovering hesitantly over his hand. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was my grandmother's. Please, sir." Marcus didn't hand it back immediately. He looked at her battered, oversized charcoal dress. He looked at the angry, swelling red handprint on her cheek, a cruel testament to her sister's rage. And then he looked into her eyes. He didn't see the erratic, unpredictable madness that Robert and Susan had so desperately tried to sell him. He saw a brilliant mind trapped behind a wall of sheer terror and systemic abuse. "The restructuring of the Carlson accounts," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, testing the waters. "In the fourth quarter of 2021, you told me to short the tech sector and pivot to renewable logistics." Clara's breath hitched. Her eyes widened, the pupils dilating in shock. For a fraction of a second, the terrified servant vanished, and the piercing, analytical gaze of the genius who had saved his life broke through. She took a sharp step back, shaking her head vigorously, though no words came out. That silence was all the confirmation Marcus needed. A profound, sickening wave of realization washed over him. The woman his future in-laws had kept hidden like a shameful secret, the woman they claimed was a mentally unstable charity case, was the very architect of his success. And if they were lying about something this colossal, what else were they lying about? "Come with me," Marcus said softly. He didn't take her to the busy kitchens or the crowded staff quarters. He guided Clara down a secluded corridor to a small, empty housekeeper's break room. He pulled out a vinyl chair and gently pressed a hand to her shoulder, silently urging her to sit. Stepping over to the small kitchenette, he wrapped a handful of ice from the freezer in a clean dish towel. When he turned back, Clara was staring at the floor, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. "Hold this to your cheek," Marcus instructed, his tone stripped of all judgment, offering only quiet care. He placed the makeshift ice pack into her hand. Clara flinched slightly at his proximity but took the ice, pressing it against her burning skin. She refused to look at him. "You should be at the altar, Mr. Sterling. The ceremony is starting soon." "Marcus?" he corrected gently. He crouched down so he was at eye level with her, forcing her to acknowledge him. "Why did you let her hit you, Clara? Why do you let them hide you?" A bitter, humorless smile touched the corners of Clara's mouth. "Because I am the foundation, Marcus. And if the foundation moves, the house collapses. They are my family. You wouldn't understand." "Try me." "You love Victoria," Clara said, her voice hollow. "You love the family they presented to you. I am just the ghost in the attic. If I speak, I lose the only roof I have, and you lose the fairy tale. Just go. Marry her. Be happy." Marcus stared at her, his heart pounding a heavy, furious rhythm against his ribs. The sheer selflessness of this woman, who had given him the world and asked for nothing, who was willing to endure physical abuse so her sister could have a perfect wedding, was staggering. "I don't believe in fairy tales anymore, Clara," Marcus said quietly. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. His face, usually so warm and inviting, had hardened into something carved from granite. "Stay here. Lock the door. Do not come out until I come back for you." Before Clara could protest, Marcus turned and walked out of the room. The clock in the hallway read 15 minutes to the hour. The guests would already be taking their seats in the grand chapel. The string quartet would be tuning their instruments. Marcus did not head toward the chapel. He turned on his heel and walked briskly back the way he had come, taking the back stairs 2 at a time until he reached the second floor. The corridor leading to the bridal suite was entirely deserted. The bridesmaids and Susan had undoubtedly gone down to the staging area to fluff Victoria's train and dab away fake tears. Marcus reached the heavy oak door of the suite and turned the brass handle. It was unlocked. He slipped inside, the door clicking softly shut behind him. The room was a disaster of discarded tulle, spilled makeup powder, and half-empty champagne flutes. It smelled oppressively of expensive floral perfume and underlying desperation. Marcus stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the chaos. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he needed proof. If he was going to blow up his own wedding, he needed ammunition. His gaze landed on the vanity. Next to the velvet jewelry box Clara had carried, Victoria's sleek, silver iPad sat propped against the mirror. The screen suddenly lit up. A notification chimed, loud in the silent room. It was an iMessage. Marcus walked over, his steps silent on the plush carpet. He looked down at the screen. The message was from a contact saved as Mom. "Susan, the florist is demanding the final wire transfer before she sets up the altar arch. Did you initiate the transfer from the trust account? Don't make a mistake, Victoria. If this bounces, we are ruined before he even says I do." Marcus frowned. Trust account? When Marcus had proposed, he had insisted on paying for the entire wedding. It was a multi-million-dollar affair, and he had the capital. But Robert, playing the role of the proud, traditional patriarch, had adamantly refused. "I am a man of means, Marcus," Robert had declared over expensive cigars. "I will pay for my daughter's wedding. It is a matter of family honor." Marcus had admired the gesture. He had respected Robert's pride. He stared at the iPad. The device was unlocked. Victoria had likely been using it to obsess over wedding photos just moments before her tantrum. Marcus reached out, his finger hovering over the screen. It felt like crossing a massive, irreversible boundary, but the red handprint on Clara's face flashed in his mind, eclipsing any guilt. He tapped the screen, opening the iMessage thread between Victoria and Susan. He scrolled up. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were PDF attachments scattered throughout the conversation. Marcus tapped on the most recent one. It was a bank statement from a private wealth management firm. The account was titled The Eleanor Miller Irrevocable Trust. Beneath the title were 2 names listed as joint beneficiaries, Clara Miller and Victoria Miller. Marcus scrolled through the pages, his analytical mind quickly digesting the numbers. The trust had been massive, likely an inheritance from their grandmother. But the recent transaction history was a bloodbath. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been hemorrhaged over the past 6 months. Payments to the country club, payments to the bridal boutique, payments to the wedding planners, the caterers, the jewelers. The family honor Robert had boasted about was a complete lie. They hadn't paid for this wedding with their own wealth. They had drained an account that belonged half to Clara. But it was the next document in the chat that made Marcus feel genuinely sick. It was a scan of a wire transfer authorization form. It required 2 signatures to release the funds. Victoria's signature was there, looping and elegant. Beside it was Clara's signature. Only Marcus had spent years studying the meticulous, sharp handwriting of his anonymous angel investor. He knew Clara's handwriting intimately. The signature on this form was a sloppy, hesitant forgery. Victoria and her parents hadn't just used Clara's money. They had committed felony wire fraud, forging the signature of the woman they had banished to the kitchens, stealing her inheritance to fund an illusion. Marcus gripped the edge of the vanity, his knuckles turning white. His breathing grew shallow as a dark, consuming rage began to build in his chest. He backed out of the PDF and returned to the main iMessage screen. His eyes caught the name of a group chat pinned to the top of Victoria's messages. It was named The Marcus Plan. He clicked on it. The chat included Victoria, Susan, and Robert. Marcus began to scroll back, going back weeks, then months, reading the casual sociopathic banter of the family he was about to marry into. Robert, October 12th. He took the bait on the golf course today. The boy is desperate for a family. He grew up with nothing, so he's blinded by the pedigree we're selling him. Hook, line, and sinker. Victoria, November 3rd. God, he is so boring, though. He wanted to talk about tech logistics at dinner. I had to pretend to care for an hour. Can we speed this up? Susan, December 15th. Patience, darling. Once the ring is on your finger, his assets become marital property. We just need to keep up the charade until the ink is dry on the marriage certificate. Marcus felt a physical ache in his chest, a deep, hollow sting of absolute betrayal. He had loved her. He had genuinely, deeply loved the woman he thought she was. To read his own affection reduced to a strategic weakness, his desire for a family mocked as pathetic, was a brutal violation. But as he scrolled closer to the present date, the messages shifted from cruel mockery to something far more sinister. Robert, February 2nd. The people from the underground tables are getting aggressive. They showed up at my club today. I need an extension. Susan, February 2nd. Tell them your future son-in-law is Marcus Sterling. Tell them his company is going public next year. That should buy us enough time until the wedding. Victoria, March 10th. Dad, you promised this wouldn't touch me. What if Marcus finds out about your gambling debts before the wedding? What if he runs a background check? Robert, March 10th. He won't. He trusts us blindly. And even if things get complicated with the forged checks from the trust account, we have our insurance policy. Marcus paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. He read the next message, and the floor seemed to drop out from beneath him. Susan, March 10th. Exactly. That's why we're keeping Clara around. Her name is on the joint account. If the feds ever look into the wire fraud, or if the money goes missing entirely, we have decades of fake medical records detailing her mental instability. We'll just say she had a manic episode, forged the documents herself, and blew the money. No jury would convict us over a crazy woman. Victoria, March 11th. Brilliant. Let her rot in a cell. It's what she deserves for being such a miserable burden anyway. Marcus stopped reading. He couldn't read anymore. He slowly lowered the iPad, placing it back on the vanity exactly where he had found it. The silence of the room was now deafening, ringing in his ears like a physical pressure. They weren't just using him to pay off a gambling debt. They had meticulously constructed a trap. They were going to use his company's assets as collateral for Robert's criminal debts. And when the financial crimes they committed to fund this charade inevitably caught up to them, they were going to throw Clara, the woman who had saved Marcus's life, to the wolves. They were going to let her go to federal prison to save their own skins. Suddenly, the heavy, resonant toll of the chapel bells began to echo across the estate courtyard. Dong, dong, dong. It was time. Marcus looked at his reflection in the mirror. He looked at the tailored tuxedo, the perfectly styled hair, the image of a groom ready to step into a lifelong commitment. He reached up and slowly, methodically, straightened his black bow tie. His expression was no longer one of a heartbroken lover. It was the cold, calculating expression of a CEO preparing for a hostile takeover. He pulled his own phone from his pocket and typed a rapid, concise message to his chief security officer, who was currently sitting in the third row of the chapel, and his personal assistant, who managed the estate's audio-visual equipment. Cancel the honeymoon flights, bring the car around to the front, and connect my secure cloud drive to the chapel's main projector immediately. Do not ask questions. Just do it. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. He picked up Victoria's iPad, slipping it seamlessly inside the inner breast pocket of his jacket. The bells continued to toll, calling him to the altar. Marcus turned and walked out of the bridal suite. He did not feel sad. He did not feel humiliated. He felt a terrifying, absolute clarity. Robert had said that family was everything, that blood was the only currency that mattered. Marcus was about to show them exactly what happened when you tried to spend currency you didn't own. He wasn't going to a wedding. He was walking into an execution, and he was the one holding the axe. The grand chapel of the estate was a masterpiece of architectural elegance, bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, and the pews were filled with the elite of the city, senators, tech moguls, and old money matriarchs draped in diamonds. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, elegant hum of a string quartet playing Bach. It was the picture-perfect climax of a high society fairy tale. Marcus stood at the altar. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him. To the hundreds of guests watching, he looked like the handsome, composed groom waiting for his true love. But behind his calm exterior, his heart beat with the slow, heavy rhythm of a war drum. In his breast pocket, pressed against his chest, Victoria's silver iPad felt as heavy as a loaded weapon. At the back of the chapel, the heavy oak doors swung open. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into the traditional wedding march. The guests rose to their feet in a wave of rustling silk and quiet murmurs of admiration. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her hand resting delicately on Robert's arm. She looked radiant. The meticulously crafted gown of French lace trailed behind her, catching the light perfectly. Her blonde hair was flawless, her makeup hiding any trace of the venomous rage she had unleashed on her sister just 30 minutes prior. She wore a smile of angelic, breathtaking purity. Beside her, Robert puffed out his chest, looking every inch the proud, wealthy patriarch giving away his most prized possession. In the front row, Susan dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the weeping, joyful mother for the cameras of the hired photographers. It was a masterful performance, a brilliant, calculated grift, and Marcus watched them walk down the aisle toward him with a chilling, absolute detachment. When Robert reached the altar, he placed Victoria's hand in Marcus's. Robert leaned in, clapping Marcus firmly on the shoulder. "Take care of my little girl, Marcus," he whispered, his voice thick with feigned emotion. "Welcome to the family." "Thank you, Robert," Marcus replied. His voice was perfectly level. "You have no idea what this family means to me." Victoria smiled up at him, her blue eyes shining with manufactured devotion. She had no idea that the man looking back at her was not the gullible, love-struck Mark she thought she had conquered. The priest, an elderly man with a warm, sonorous voice, stepped up to the podium and opened his leather-bound Bible. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Marcus let him speak. He let the beautiful, sacred words wash over the silent chapel. He let Victoria revel in the absolute certainty of her victory. He waited until the priest reached the most critical moment of the ceremony. "If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now, or else forever hold their peace." The priest paused, a mere formality, expecting the traditional respectful silence. Marcus took a half-step back, letting go of Victoria's hands. "I have a cause," Marcus said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the chapel like a crack of thunder. The priest blinked, adjusting his glasses, assuming he had misheard. A ripple of confusion swept through the pews. Susan's lace handkerchief froze mid-air. Robert's proud smile faltered. Victoria let out a soft, nervous giggle, reaching out to touch his arm. "Marcus, darling, what are you doing? This isn't the time for a joke." "It's not a joke, Victoria," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. He looked at the priest. "I apologize, Father, but I cannot stand before God and marry a fraud." A collective audible gasp erupted from the hundreds of guests. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying in its heaviness. Victoria's face drained of color, turning a sickly ashen gray. "Marcus, what are you talking about? Are you ill?" Robert stepped forward, his face flushing dark red. "Marcus, son, you are embarrassing my daughter. Stop this nonsense right now and take her hand." "I am not your son," Marcus said smoothly. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the sleek silver iPad. Victoria's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as she recognized her device. Her breath hitched, a strangled sound escaping her throat. She lunged forward, dropping the angelic act entirely. "Give that to me. You have no right to go through my things." Marcus easily sidestepped her frantic grab. He looked over the crowd, locking eyes with his chief security officer in the third row, who gave a curt nod. Beside him, Marcus's personal assistant tapped a few keys on a laptop connected to the chapel's state-of-the-art audiovisual system. Usually, the two massive digital screens flanking the altar were used to project hymns or tasteful montages of the couple. Now they flared to life with something entirely different. Projected in massive, unforgiving high definition for the senators, the CEOs, and the high society matriarchs to see, was a bank statement, the Eleanor Miller Irrevocable Trust. Whispers broke out among the pews like a lit fuse. People leaned forward, squinting at the screen, recognizing the sheer volume of wealth draining from the account, reading the names of the caterers and dressmakers. "What is the meaning of this?" Robert bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. He turned to the crowd, raising his hands. "This is a private financial matter. Turn those screens off immediately." "It's not private when it's felony wire fraud, Robert," Marcus said, his voice echoing through the chapel microphone. He gestured to the screen, which suddenly transitioned to the scanned authorization form. At the bottom of the form, blown up to 10 feet tall, were the two signatures, Victoria's elegant cursive, and beside it, the crude, trembling forgery of Clara's name. "You didn't pay for this wedding, Robert," Marcus continued, his tone clinical and precise, dismantling the patriarch piece by piece. "You stole the funds from a trust belonging to your eldest daughter. You forged her signature to fund an illusion of wealth you haven't possessed in years." Susan let out a dramatic, piercing wail, clutching her chest and collapsing against the front pew. Several guests gasped, but no one moved to help her. They were too mesmerized by the spectacular destruction unfolding before them. "He's lying!" Victoria screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. Tears streaked her perfect makeup, but they were tears of rage, not sorrow. "He hacked my device. He fabricated those documents. Clara is insane. She did this." Marcus didn't argue. He just nodded to his assistant. The screens flickered again. The bank documents vanished, replaced by the blue and gray bubbles of an iMessage group chat. The Marcus plan. The guests, people who valued reputation and loyalty above all else, read the words in stunned, horrified silence. They read Robert boasting, hook, line, and sinker. They read Victoria complaining, "He is so boring. Can we speed this up?" They read Susan plotting, "Once the ring is on her finger, his assets become marital property." But it was the final messages that sealed their fate. The text regarding Robert's underground gambling debts. The text revealing their plan to use Marcus's tech company as collateral to pay off the mob. And the most damning text of all, the plan to frame Clara, using fake medical records to paint her as mentally unstable, letting her take the fall and rot in a cell for their financial crimes. The chapel was no longer quiet. It was a cacophony of outrage, disgust, and shock. The elite society that Robert and Susan had spent their lives trying to impress was now looking at them with open, undisguised revulsion. Victoria fell to her knees, her heavy lace gown pooling around her like a collapsed parachute. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, the reality of her utter ruin finally crashing down upon her. But Robert was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. Like a cornered rat, he abandoned all pretense of dignity and bared his teeth. "You think you're so smart, Sterling?" Robert spat, his face purple with fury. He marched up the altar steps, getting inches from Marcus's face. "You think you can humiliate my family and walk away? I will sue you for everything you own. Breach of contract, defamation, emotional distress. I will tie your company up in litigation for the next decade." Marcus didn't flinch. "You can't afford a lawyer, Robert." "And as for that useless, ungrateful bitch Clara," Robert roared, spinning around to address the room, spit flying from his lips. "She is dead to me. She has lived under my roof, eating my food. I am going back to that house right now, and I am throwing her out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. I will freeze whatever is left in that trust. She will be penniless and begging in the gutter by nightfall." I highly doubt that. The voice was calm. It was quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable, commanding authority that instantly silenced Robert's ranting. Every head in the chapel turned toward the back doors. Clara stood in the entryway. She was no longer the hunched, terrified servant Marcus had found in the housekeeper's room. She still wore the drab charcoal dress, but her posture had entirely transformed. Her spine was straight, her chin held high. The severe, messy bun had been let down, her dark hair falling gracefully around her shoulders. Pinned elegantly to the side of her hair was the tarnished copper clip, the overlapping crescent moon and rising sun. She walked down the long carpeted aisle. The wealthy guests, the same people who would have ignored her an hour ago, instinctively parted for her, feeling the profound shift in power. Marcus stepped down from the altar to meet her halfway, a look of profound respect softening his sharp features. Robert stared at his eldest daughter as if a ghost had just walked into the room. "You?" he stammered, his bravado momentarily failing him. "How dare you show your face here? Get out!" Clara stopped a few feet away from her father. She looked at Victoria, weeping on the floor, and at Susan, still faking a fainting spell in the pew. Finally, her dark, intelligent eyes locked onto Robert. There was no fear left in her. The chains of her childhood conditioning had been shattered the moment she realized they were willing to send her to federal prison. "I am not going anywhere, Robert," Clara said, her voice steady and resonant. "And you will not be throwing me out of the house. Because as of 45 minutes ago, you no longer own it." Robert laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "You've finally lost your mind. The house is in my name." "The house," Clara corrected smoothly, "was collateral for the $3 million you owe to the men you refer to as the underground tables. Men who were growing very, very impatient." Robert's breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. How do you know about that?" Clara didn't raise her voice, but every word struck like a hammer. "While Marcus was standing at the altar, preparing to expose your wire fraud, I was sitting in the housekeeper's room, making a few phone calls. You see, I knew you were stealing from the trust. I let you take it, because the trust was merely a decoy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus watched her, a proud, slight smile playing on his lips. "For the past 10 years, Clara continued, her gaze piercing through her father's crumbling facade, I have been the silent, majority shareholder and lead strategist for Vanguard Holdings. It's an angel investment and debt restructuring firm." A collective gasp echoed from the pews. Several of the tech moguls and bankers in the crowd immediately recognized the name. Vanguard Holdings was a legend in the financial district, a ghost firm known for aggressive, brilliant takeovers. "And 45 minutes ago," Clara stated, her voice as cold and clear as cut glass, "Vanguard Holdings purchased your debt from your creditors at a premium. I own your markers, Robert. I own the deed to the estate. I own the cars. I own the country club memberships." Robert stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. He grasped the wooden edge of the pew to keep from collapsing. "You have nothing," Clara said softly, delivering the final, fatal blow. "You are not a patriarch. You are a trespasser in my home, and you have until midnight to pack whatever fits in a single suitcase and vacate the premises." Susan let out a genuine, piercing shriek. Victoria looked up from the floor, her makeup smeared into a grotesque mask, realizing that the sister she had slapped, abused, and hidden away was now the absolute master of their fate. "Clara, please!" Susan cried, dropping the fainting act and crawling toward her daughter's feet. "We're your family. You can't do this to your own blood." Clara looked down at her mother, feeling absolutely nothing. "Blood is the only currency that truly matters, isn't it, Mother? Consider your account bankrupt." She turned away from them, effectively erasing them from her life. She looked at Marcus. He stood quietly, holding the velvet box containing the wedding ring he was supposed to give Victoria. With a flick of his thumb, he snapped the box shut and tossed it casually onto the floor next to Victoria's discarded bouquet. He held out his arm to Clara. "Shall we?" Marcus asked, his eyes warm and respectful. Clara looked at his offered arm. For the first time in 32 years, she did not feel the weight of duty or the crushing pressure of abuse. She felt light. She felt powerful. She felt free. She slipped her hand through his arm. "Yes, I believe this party is over." Together, they turned their backs on the altar, on the weeping bride, and the ruined parents. They walked back down the aisle, the sea of wealthy guests parting for them in stunned silence. They stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the chapel and into the bright, warm sunlight of the afternoon, leaving the ashes of a brilliant lie behind them and stepping forward into a future built entirely on the truth. The heavy oak doors of the chapel closed behind Clara and Marcus, muffling the chaotic sounds of weeping and shouting from inside. Stepping out into the warm, golden afternoon sun, Clara took her first breath as a truly free woman. The air tasted different. It tasted like possibility. They walked in silence down the sweeping gravel driveway of the estate. The valet, who had undoubtedly heard the commotion echoing from the open chapel windows, stood perfectly straight, his eyes wide with restrained curiosity as he brought Marcus's sleek black sedan to the front. Marcus opened the passenger door for Clara. It was a simple gesture, but one performed with a level of profound respect she had never experienced. She slid into the leather seat, the faded fabric of her charcoal dress stark against the luxury of the car. As Marcus slipped behind the wheel and started the engine, he didn't immediately pull away. He turned to look at her, studying the sharp, intelligent lines of her profile, the faint remnants of the red mark on her cheek, and the tarnished copper clip holding back her dark hair. "Vanguard Holdings," Marcus said softly, a slow, admiring smile spreading across his face. "For 5 years, I pictured a silver-haired Wall Street veteran smoking a cigar in a penthouse. I never imagined my guardian angel was a 32-year-old woman holding her family's crumbling empire together." Clara finally looked at him, a genuine, albeit tired, smile touching her lips. "The cigar would have ruined my palate for cheap coffee. And the silver hair, well, give it a few more years. Robert and Susan have certainly done their best to expedite the process." Marcus let out a deep, genuine laugh. It was a warm, resonant sound that filled the car, banishing the last lingering shadows of the chapel. He shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the estate. "Where to?" he asked. "Downtown," Clara replied, her gaze fixing on the horizon. "I have a house to repossess at midnight, and I need to stop by my office to finalize the foreclosure paperwork. I want security waiting at the gates by 11. The rest of the evening passed with a swift, clinical precision. For Clara, there was no hesitation, no lingering guilt. The moment Susan had casually agreed to let Clara take the fall for federal wire fraud, the last frayed thread of familial obligation had snapped. By 11:30 that night, the grand wrought-iron gates of the Miller estate were flanked by 4 private security contractors hired by Vanguard Holdings. Clara sat in the back of a tinted SUV parked just across the street, watching the scene unfold. Through the massive bay windows of the brightly lit mansion, she could see the frantic, pathetic scramble of her family. Victoria was having a full-blown hysterical meltdown in the foyer. Through the open front doors, Clara watched her sister attempting to drag 3 massive, oversized Louis Vuitton trunks toward the exit. The lead security officer, a burly man with no patience for high society tantrums, stepped forward, holding up a clipboard. "1 suitcase per person, Ms. Miller, as per the eviction notice." "These are my clothes!" Victoria shrieked, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn. The perfect bridal updo was completely ruined, her hair sticking to her tear-streaked face. "You can't take my clothes. Do you know how much these cost?" Everything in this house, including the contents of those trunks, was purchased using funds from a fraudulently drained trust and credit lines secured by unpaid collateral, the officer stated mechanically. "It belongs to the creditor. 1 suitcase. Or you leave with nothing but the clothes on your back." Susan was sobbing dramatically on the front steps, clutching a small vanity case to her chest, looking around wildly as if expecting one of her wealthy country club friends to suddenly appear and save them. But the phones had been ringing unanswered all evening. Word traveled at light speed among the elite. The Millers were radioactive. Robert was the last to emerge. The proud, booming patriarch looked completely deflated, his shoulders slumped, his face a sickly gray under the porch lights. He carried a single leather duffel bag. As he walked out, he tried to casually slip a small, rolled-up oil painting under his coat. "Drop the canvas, Mr. Miller," the security officer commanded instantly, stepping into Robert's path. Robert froze, his face flushing with deep, ugly humiliation. With trembling hands, he let the rolled canvas fall to the marble porch. Clara watched without a shred of pity. They had built their entire lives on theft and deception, stepping on her back to reach higher ground. Now, gravity had simply done its job. At exactly midnight, the security guards escorted Robert, Susan, and Victoria out the front gates. The heavy iron doors clanged shut behind them, the locks echoing with a harsh, final finality. The 3 of them stood on the dark sidewalk, a far cry from the glittering elite they had pretended to be just hours before. They had no cars, no credit cards, and nowhere to go. Clara tapped the glass of the SUV. The driver pulled away quietly, leaving the ruined family in the darkness. The next morning, Clara woke up to a sensation she had never felt before in her entire life: absolute silence. She was sitting at the massive marble kitchen island of the estate, nursing a cup of black coffee. The house, usually buzzing with the demands of her mother, the complaints of her sister, and the blustering arrogance of her father, was completely still. It was beautiful. A soft knock at the back terrace door broke the quiet. Clara looked up to see Marcus standing on the patio, holding 2 white paper bags from a local bakery that smelled intensely of fresh croissants and roasted espresso. He was dressed casually this morning, a simple navy sweater and slacks, looking less like a billionaire CEO and more like a man simply happy to be alive. Clara unlocked the door, a warm flutter igniting in her chest at the sight of him. "You know, the house is technically foreclosed. You're trespassing." "I brought bribes," Marcus said, lifting the bakery bags with a boyish grin. He stepped inside, placing the bags on the island. He looked around the massive, quiet kitchen, then back to Clara. She was wearing a simple, soft cashmere sweater she had retrieved from her hidden apartment downtown, her hair pulled back in a loose, comfortable braid. She looked relaxed, radiant, and incredibly beautiful. They sat at the island, sharing pastries and coffee, the conversation flowing with an ease and depth that neither had ever experienced with anyone else. Marcus told her about the chaotic fallout from the aborted wedding. The high society gossip mills were working overtime. Robert's creditors from the underground tables had reportedly found him at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town that morning, demanding the money he no longer had. Susan had been permanently blacklisted from every country club and charity board in the state, and Victoria had been spotted screaming at a pawn shop owner who refused to give her face value for a diamond bracelet she had managed to sneak out in her pocket. "They destroyed themselves," Marcus said quietly, taking a sip of his coffee. "You just handed them the match." "I spent my whole life thinking my silence was protecting them," Clara murmured, looking down at her mug. "I thought if I just worked harder, if I just endured a little more, I could fix them. But you can't fix people who are fundamentally broken by their own greed." Marcus reached across the marble island, gently placing his hand over hers. His thumb lightly traced the knuckles of her calloused fingers. "You don't have to fix anyone anymore, Clara," he said, his voice deep and rough with emotion. "You've spent your entire life being the foundation for a house that didn't deserve you. It's time to build something for yourself." Clara looked up, meeting his steady, earnest gaze. The connection between them crackled with an undeniable intellectual electricity. This wasn't the shallow, manufactured romance Marcus had been sold by Victoria. This was a partnership born of mutual respect, shared struggles, and a profound alignment of minds. Over the next 6 months, the world shifted on its axis. Vanguard Holdings stepped out of the shadows. Clara, no longer needing to hide behind the facade of a dowdy servant, took her rightful place as the CEO. She walked into boardrooms wearing impeccably tailored suits, commanding attention not with loud arrogance, but with a terrifying, razor-sharp intelligence that left seasoned executives speechless. She and Marcus began to work together openly. Their companies merged several key logistics divisions, creating a powerhouse conglomerate that dominated the market. They were a formidable team, moving in perfect sync, anticipating each other's thoughts and strategies before a word was even spoken. And somewhere amidst the late-night strategy sessions, the quiet dinners overlooking the city skyline, and the Sunday mornings spent reading the financial papers in comfortable silence, respect blossomed into a deep, unwavering love. It was a mature, quiet kind of love. The kind that didn't need grand theatrical declarations or million-dollar weddings to prove its validity. It was the kind of love built on absolute trust, the kind that whispered, "I see you, exactly as you are, and you are enough." A year later, the estate's grand chapel was opened once again. But this time, the heavy oak doors did not welcome hundreds of senators or superficial socialites. There were no hired photographers, no forced tears, no symphony orchestras. There were only 20 people sitting in the wooden pews. Marcus's closest friends, his loyal executives, and the few mentors who had stood by him when he was a struggling kid in a garage. At the altar stood Marcus, wearing a simple, elegant black suit. His eyes were shining with an emotion so profound it made his chest ache. The doors opened and Clara walked down the aisle. She walked alone. She didn't need anyone to give her away. She belonged entirely to herself. She wore a stunning, understated silk gown that draped flawlessly over her frame. No heavy lace, no suffocating tulle, just pure, unadulterated grace. As she reached the altar, Marcus took both of her hands in his. He didn't look at the audience. He only looked at her. "For 5 years," Marcus whispered, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I searched for the person who saved my life. I thought I owed them a debt I could never repay. I didn't know I was looking for my equal. I didn't know I was looking for my home." Clara smiled, a single happy tear slipping down her cheek. I spent my life hiding in the shadows, believing I was invisible, she replied softly. You were the first person who truly saw me. You didn't see a servant. You didn't see a broken woman. You saw me, and you made me brave enough to step into the light. The elderly priest smiled warmly at them both. There was no tension in the room, no secrets waiting to explode, only the quiet, powerful resonance of truth. When Marcus slipped the simple, elegant gold band onto Clara's finger, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a promise, sealed not with forged documents or stolen wealth, but with genuine, unshakable devotion. Far away from the peace of the estate, in a dingy, cramped apartment on the wrong side of the city, Victoria sat in a worn-out uniform, staring blankly at a television screen. She had just finished a 12-hour shift as a hostess at a mid-tier chain restaurant, her feet aching, her pride completely shattered. Her parents were sleeping on a pull-out couch in the next room, constantly bickering over food stamps and mounting legal fees from Robert's ongoing fraud investigations. Victoria looked down at her hands. They were no longer perfectly manicured. The nails were chipped, the skin dry from washing dishes. She thought about the millions of dollars she had thrown away, the billionaire she had tried to con, and the quiet, plain sister she had slapped out of pure arrogance. Silence had not been obedience, she finally realized. Far too late. Silence had been a loaded gun, and Victoria had pulled the trigger on herself. Back at the estate, Clara and Marcus stepped out of the chapel hand in hand. The late afternoon sun bathed the manicured lawns in a warm, golden glow. There were no screaming crowds, no flashy exits. They simply walked together across the grass, heading toward the main house. The grand estate was no longer a monument to someone else's lies. It was theirs. Clara leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder as they walked, the tarnished copper clip gleaming softly in her dark hair. Justice had been served, the demons of her past had been vanquished, and the future, vast, bright, and utterly her own, was finally beginning.